Good evening. Wasn't that amazing? My name is David Boardman. I'm the Dean of the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University. I'm also the founding chair of what's called the Lenfest Institute for Journalism that owns the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's a nonprofit that helps keep good journalism here in our region. And I used to be the editor-in-chief of the Seattle Times newspaper. But most importantly, tonight, I'm a proud resident of media and immensely proud of the place that our town played in the history of our country, as you learned about tonight. We're all here to celebrate the 54th anniversary of that event, and I'm guessing that for most of us, it's the first time in our lives that we've celebrated a crime. But, you know, as you saw in that wonderful film, the break-in in the media office right next door was truly a meritorious act of civil disobedience. And I think, particularly in the time we live in right now, this whole question of what civil disobedience is all about has never been more important. What those burglars discovered in those documents that they stole that evening would change the course of history, as you saw, and would remind us all that a democratic government can only survive if the citizens hold it to take a check on power. This event reminds us of a subject that's near and dear to my heart as a journalist as well, the importance of a free press. Without a reporter and without a newspaper that were willing to tell that story and to publish the revelations in those documents, standing up to a lot of pressure, as you saw from that White House, J. Edgar Hoover might have continued in his role for many years and continued those dirty tricks. So, without that same investigative reporter, of course, we still wouldn't know who those burglars were and the fascinating story of their courageous actions that you saw in that film. So we're so fortunate to have with us here tonight that very reporter, along with two of the stars of that amazing tale. Before I introduce them, please join me in thanking the organizer of the event, who you saw at the beginning, Stacy Olkowski. She's a true force of nature who really is the visionary behind the big 50th anniversary of the burglary celebration that we had 4 years ago, part of which was the installation of the historic sign that's outside the building back in 2021, and she really has kept these commemorations going. She's also a great Quizzo player. She's on my team every Wednesday. Also with us, I believe, in the audience tonight is the person we have to thank most for that commemorative sign, Kevin Tustin. Kevin, are you here? All right. Kevin is the journalist who applied for and really lobbied and sort of brought everybody together to make the commemoration happen. So thanks, Kevin. Also want to again thank the Media Arts Council and the Delaware County Institute of Science. I also want to acknowledge one of the stars of the movie that you saw, who is a man that sadly is no longer with us, but I had the great pleasure to come to know him on the campus of Temple University before he passed away in 2017, and that, of course, is John Raines. John taught at Temple, I believe, for almost 50 years, and he inspired countless students to find their own ways to make the world a better place. So now it's my pleasure to introduce these three stars of the movie. The first, all the way to the left, is the remarkable woman who cased the joint next door, John's wife, Bonnie Raines. And Bonnie has had a lifetime of working for social justice. She founded child care centers for Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and LaSalle University. She established new standards of quality care for infants and toddlers and preschoolers. And she also has coordinated something called the Picasso Project, which raised money for the arts in the Philadelphia public schools. And then to my immediate left here is the brave soul who picked the lock and work the crowbar. Looks pretty much exactly like you did back then. Keith, like me, is an Ohio native, moved to Philly in 1970, and he immediately became active in the movement against the Vietnam War. He was later involved in a variety of community and union organizing projects, worked as a cab driver, as a press operator, and an electrician before going back to school and becoming an engineer. He is still working for justice in a variety of ways and has been really active, particularly in the movement against gerrymandering in the state of Pennsylvania. So please welcome Keith. Is the amazing journalist without whom we might never know this story, Betty MEDBURG. Betty began her career at the Tribune Democrat in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, not too far from where she grew up. She came to Philly to work at the now defunct Philadelphia Bulletin. You might remember everybody read the Bulletin. At least they said so. I guess not, because it didn't survive. But and that's where she met John and Bonnie Raines. She was a religion reporter. She then moved to the Washington Post, where she received the notorious box of documents that were stolen from the FBI office. She wouldn't know for more than 20 years who sent her those documents, and it took another 23 years until she was able to really tell the world in her wonderful book, copies of which are available at the back table, and Betty will be signing them tonight. She is a really highly respected journalist. She was somebody I knew for years before coming here, and my little piece of this whole project was when I moved from Seattle to Media, I put it on my Facebook page. Hey, I moved to a place called Media, Pennsylvania. Isn't that funny? Media. And Betty reached out to me and said, hey, I need you to go double check an address for me. She always checks her facts carefully. She's the author of several books, and she is a longtime journalism educator, and I'm really proud to call her not only my Facebook friend, but my real friend. So please welcome Betty. I hope you all took Stacy's instructions and thought up questions that you want to ask these folks. So I'm going to start with a few, but I'm then going to walk around and do the Phil Donahue thing, and you're going to ask some good questions. So let's start with Bonnie. You know, for me, one of the most lasting passages in this film, and I've thought about it so many times as a parent, was when you acknowledged that had you all been caught, you would have been put away for a very long time, you and John. And you talked about how you had made some plans around that, and to me it was just especially chilling to contemplate that with 3 young children. How did the two of you even process that decision? Talk about those conversations and how you came to the decision.
Well, I think
bring this around to you.
Okay. Is this making any difference?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't have to use my 3rd grade teacher voice. We were very much involved in the protests against the war. Philadelphia was very much the center of the protests against the war. And we lived in Germantown at that time, and that was really a resistance community that we participated in. And we were more and more deeply disturbed by what was happening with that horrific war and the lies the government was telling us about casualties, military and civilian casualties. And so we just were more and more frustrated because the things that we would normally have been hoping would make a difference, marches and rallies and meeting with congressmen people, were not making any difference. And so I think we believed that something a little more radical was being called for, and we believed that it was important to get out to the American people the truth about what the government was doing, what the FBI was doing, with no oversight whatsoever. So I think it came from for me, I was just pretty enraged about what was happening to my country, to the future for my children. And we felt empowered by the kinds of civil disobedience that we had participated in previously. We felt empowered to believe that there was something we could do to stand up to the injustice. And so we just made a commitment to each other that we would, as long as we could participate in something that was nonviolent and would matter in a new and different way in terms of getting the truth out to the American people, and that would then start something new in the country, which was oversight of the intelligence agencies and accountability. So does that give you a little bit of a...
Yeah. And I want to ask you the same question of you, Keith. Like I've thought a lot about when you talk about, okay, I try to pick the first lock, that doesn't work because it's the wrong kind of lock you learned how to pick, and you move to the other one and you're hearing a noise on the other side, and I mean, you knew, man, if there's somebody there, you know, I'm going to federal prison for who knows how long. Talk about that. I mean, how does your mind even process that in the spur of the moment?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple of pieces to that. One is those of us, you know, like Bonnie and John and Bill, who had been involved in draft board raids. Everybody, I would hope everybody in that movement realized that if you keep breaking into draft boards in the middle of the night and tearing up their files or stealing them, sooner or later you're going to get caught. You're just not going to get away forever. So you prepare yourself to go to jail. And it's funny in retrospect, there was I can't remember who it was right now, but one of the people who had been involved, who was a member of the Resistance, which is the group that organized draft refusal and burning of draft cards and so on, who had gone to prison, wrote a book of advice for movement people who were going to go to jail, like do's and don'ts, you know. So I bought the book and read that so I would be ready. I was big on preparation. So part of it is just being realistic about what you're doing. You know, if you're doing that kind of activity, you'd be extremely lucky if you never got caught. So you're already ready that way. And the other part is my personality. I'm extremely stubborn, which sometimes is a good thing and sometimes not so good. So once I walked in there, you know, if I had heard somebody say, "What time is it, J. Edgar?" I probably would have left. But just a banging noise that probably was the heating system was, you know, not enough to overcome my inherent stubbornness.
That's great. Betty, there were more than 200 FBI agents assigned to find these guys. What's your sense of how close did they actually get?
I'd just like to say briefly, before I answer your question, something about the film. One of the things that moves me most about the film is the very end, where Nathan Raines, in that wonderful, respectful, and also partly incredulous voice, says, "They risked everything." And I think the fact that the burglars were never found, people lose sight of the fact, perhaps, that who they were, but also that these 8 people did, in fact, risk the possibility of decades of freedom. And so I'd just like to honor that fact.
Two questions for you. The first one is, just in your research, how close did the FBI actually come to finding?
Well, in the end, there was only one of the 8 burglars, Bob Williamson, who was a suspect. They moved through, first of all, they went through a couple thousand people as suspects. And they had somewhat unique ways of looking for people. Length of hair,
By
sideburns.
unique, you mean incompetent.
And well, unique in that I think anybody thinking of what they would look for would not be those qualities. But also whether or not people lived on a commune, and women who were part of women's consciousness raising groups. I mean, in all seriousness, a man walked into a consciousness raising session in Paulton Village and went there for another purpose, but noticed that these women were gathering in the next room and decided, well, maybe that's where some suspects are, given what the women were talking about, their basic rights, things like that. So that I read the 34,000-page official investigation of the burglary. Not exactly scintillating, but very interesting, and to use Keith's word, really a lot of incompetence, beginning with the decision on the first day after the burglary that they knew who led the group. They named the person, and it was ironic because that person was someone who was a leader involved in drug board raids, but whom the group, beginning with Bill Davidon, the leader of the group, had decided this is the last person we want to have involved in this action. They loved him, but he talked a lot, and
Loose lips sink ships.
but the FBI, from that day until the end of the 5-year investigation, they believed that he was leader of the group, and that took them off the track completely from who really was involved. And I would also like to point out that everybody in the group of 8 was considered a suspect at some point and dropped, but one person was never named as a suspect, and that person was the woman that they started out looking for the most, the woman who had cased the inside of the body raids. Her name never appeared in the investigation.
Can I step on Becky's question for a second? So, I just want to add one other factor that I personally think is a major part of it. The fact that the organization was run by a megalomaniac and full of yes men didn't help. But also, the number of potential suspects was huge. So even if they had not been the Keystone Cops, they still would have had a really hard time. I mean, there were many thousands of people in Philadelphia who were relatively active in the movement, and there were hundreds that were more or less full-time. That was their more or less full-time job, a non-paying job, but you know, that's what we did all day, every day. So there was too many suspects. And I think, you know, that's, you know, there are some people here who remember those days, I'm sure, but there are some people who don't. The scale of the movement, you know, it wasn't a majority of the country, but it was a lot of people, and that made their job much harder.
One other fascinating aspect of it that isn't really featured so much in the movie, but you talk about it in the book. And when I talk about you and this, and particularly the book to people who know nothing about it, it's one of the stories I tell. And I guess I want Betty and Bonnie to both talk about this. The night when you actually learned who the burglars were. Would you talk about that, Betty and Bonnie?
Well, many years after the burglary, and also I left the Washington Post, I moved to California, and I was teaching there, and I found myself with a long weekend in Philadelphia between some academic assignments that I had in Missouri and then in Massachusetts. So I decided to give myself the gift of a weekend in Philadelphia and to fill it with breakfast, coffees, dinners with old friends that I had known when I worked here. And first people I saw on that Friday evening were John and Bonnie Raines. And I had treasured their friendship through the years, but it had been a long time since I'd seen them. And they readily agreed I should come to dinner that evening, and we sat around catching each other up on what had been happening in our lives for the last 10 years or so. And then we went to the dinner table. Do you want to pick it up from there?
So after dinner, our youngest daughter, Mary, strolled through the dining room, and John said, he stopped Mary and he said, "Mary, I want you to meet Betty Metzger because you haven't had a chance to meet her." And she, when we had some very important information about the FBI, we sent it to Betty. And it didn't mean a thing to my daughter. It didn't mean anything.
Did
But
John clear this with you first?
Oh no, he said he blurted it out. He blurted. And then Betty fell off her chair. So it took us a couple minutes to regroup. But being the journalist that she is, she very quickly said, "Well, my God, you've got to help me. First of all, find the other members of the group if we possibly can do that, and help me get started on a book so I can tell the whole story." And she was off and running with this opportunity. But it was just completely accidental. We never thought it would emerge in any way. Fortunately, it emerged to the most competent person I could think of to carry the ball on it.
I was truly shocked. And actually, they had told me, I didn't suggest a book that night, because they had also told me that when the group met for the last time, 10 days after the burglary, after they had prepared all the packets of information to send out to 2 members of Congress and 3 journalists, they told me that the group had made 2 promises that day, and that was, first of all, that they wouldn't associate with each other because of concern that the arrest of one might lead to the arrest of another, but that they also had promised each other that they would take the secret of the burglary to their graves. And so that's why I pointed to, I respected that, but I couldn't think of anything else for a few weeks after they told me this, and then got in touch with John and Bonnie and said, "This is such an important piece of history, and I think the public should know about it, and would you try to find the others?" But I was truly shocked.
Thank you. All right, I have some more questions, but let's take some from the audience. So if you please stand up and talk loud, because Mike doesn't reach out there.
How much risk were you at the time that you were disclosing this?
Say again. I'm
How
sorry.
much risk were you at the time that you were disclosing this and revealing yourself?
Oh, so by the time it came out in Betty's book, how much risk was there at that time?
For quite a while, we weren't able to determine whether there was a statute of limitations on the case, which had us very worried because it seemed like it could be just open-ended and that they could prosecute us at any time. But we did learn that the case was closed after 5 years because they could not build a case. We left no physical evidence in the office. They couldn't follow up with any of the suspects. They just had no case, so it was closed in 1976, I believe. There still was a possibility. Initially, Hoover wanted to charge us with espionage if we were arrested, and that would have been life in prison. And that's what Edward Snowden has been charged with, as a matter of fact. But eventually, we were able to understand that they were no longer looking for us, and they couldn't prosecute us after the statute of limitations was closed. Did that answer your question? Okay.
I would say, in that 34,000 page document, investigation document, there was the file saying that it had been closed after 5 years. But I remain concerned because I'm aware that attorney generals and FBI people can play various kinds of tricks. And so I was really concerned right up until the time we published. And the reporters who wrote the initial stories about the revelation that was going to be made, their names, went to the FBI just a couple days before publication and broadcast. And at that time, the FBI said, well, as a matter of fact, we think that some positive changes occurred in the FBI as a result of that, and that burglary. And I didn't feel relief until that.
So let's hope you don't hear from Cash Patel. Next question, yeah. Stand and loud, please.
So in the film, it says that you were the only, of the 5 first mailings, only you didn't hand them back in and publish them. And then there were more mailings, I guess. Once the Washington Post published them, did it open up that others then did? Everybody was afraid until that first time.
That's right. The 2 members of Congress took the documents immediately to the FBI without making the contents public. That was Senator McGovern and Tara Mitchell, member of Congress from Baltimore. And I didn't know until, again, when I read that 34,000-page investigation decades later, what had happened at the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, that both of them had turned in the documents to the FBI and not written about them for very different, under very different circumstances. The LA Times Washington Bureau received them. They had been addressed to Jack Nelson, and that was a really bright decision on the part of the burglars to send them to Jack. He was one of the greatest investigative reporters at the time, and here was the problem, that he was one of approximately 2 reporters in the country who had written anything that raised questions about J. Edgar Hoover's practices. Not the kind of secret things, but some actions that he had taken. And Hoover hated him for that, and had it gone directly to the publisher in Los Angeles and also to the bureau chief in Washington, trying to get Jack fired. They refused to do that. But then the FBI, as it turned out, had a sub-editor in the Washington Bureau who was watching Jack's mail. And that editor, what saw the envelope come, Jack never saw it. And they took it directly to the FBI. Actually, what happened in the New York Times is a more telling thing about the culture of the Times. I mean, that's with a small t. Tom Wicker was a columnist at the Times, and he was the second person who had written some things that raised questions about J. Edgar Hoover's practices. And when he received it, he took it to a reporter who covered the FBI and said, okay, I'm a columnist, you're covering the FBI, and it's more appropriate that you look at this. And that reporter, Fred Graham, looked at it and then immediately took it to the FBI without writing about it. And I interviewed him when I was working on the book, and he expressed an attitude that was very common at that time, that he felt that it was appropriate to let the FBI keep its secrets. And that's the pervasive culture that existed then. And that thanks to this, the Pentagon Papers and Watergate started to crack. But at that time, there was a culture that it was journalists' obligation, as well as congressional, frankly, to protect the secrets of intelligence agencies and the FBI law enforcement functions. And so it was a natural thing to do that. But yes, you're right, that as soon as we published then other people also published.
Another audience question? Yes.
Hi Bonnie, hi Betty.
Hi, Kevin.
Had the robbery, if the robbery took place today and everything that followed fell in the exact same trap, how do you think the media response would have been different? Do you think the contents would have been as important today, or do you think it would be focused on who are these people that broke in and they're so awful, we need to find them?
Keith, why don't you take the first round?
Wow, I don't know. It's obviously speculative, but I think, you know, it's hard to say that the media landscape is so fractured, you know, anymore. There's nobody, with the possible exception of the New York Times, with the status that the Post had in those days. So, you know, in our day, we had the underground press, right? And they published the documents too, but nobody outside the movement read the underground press, so, or paid any attention to it. So if it hadn't been for the Post, the impact of this would have been slim to none. You know, today it's very hard to say. You know, people tend to read the news that they want to hear, and so I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
Well, there still are whistleblowers, however,
Yes.
functioning, thank God. And we need those whistleblowers. So that, for me, is one hopeful piece of our situation right now, is that there are still people who are willing to stick their neck out and tell the truth about even something like the FBI or the CIA. And hopefully those whistleblowers, they're supposed to be protected in a democracy. I think that's also under threat now too. But thank God for the whistleblowers, because we continue to need them in a democracy that is authentic.
If you had something like this today, it would be much easier to get it published, perhaps also broadcast, but certainly published. It's been very interesting to me to watch since the inauguration what's been happening with the news media and the publication of the things that the Trump administration has been doing, and especially the Washington Post. The Washington Post has been revealing some days, several stories about inside what DOJ is doing. And in every one of those stories, either in the middle of the story or at the very end, there's a box that lists like 2 or 3 reporters with their email addresses, but then in addition to that, specific information on how you, and these would be whistleblowers, how you can get information to us securely, and then we will be in touch with you. It's a tremendous system that they've established.
Great. Go ahead.
Yes.
So first, I'm in awe of your bravery and principles and just sheer determination to go through with this. It's just incredible. So I have a simple question, which is, it's inspiring, and it makes us proud to be this part of media where it happened, which, you know, of course, it could have happened anywhere, I suppose. But my question is a simple one, which is, you sent photocopies, as I understand, of all of the documents, and you were careful to wear gloves so that your fingerprints weren't on the photocopies. What happened to the original documents?
Hey, who wants to take that one?
I don't think they're in the Smithsonian. Nor should they be.
Too bad the Constitution Center didn't exist.
Oh, yeah. But, no, I mean, once we did everything we could in our capacity to get the word out there and into the right hands in terms of journalism and law enforcement and congressional oversight, we would have been very crazy to hold on to any documents as souvenirs. So I think, do you remember, I think we had a big bonfire at Hanford College. Big bonfire.
Burn the evidence, that's my advice.
We toasted marshmallows over those documents.
All right, next question.
So, did the FBI come to the Washington Post? Did a courier take a couple pages to the FBI? How did they identify their own documents?
Oh, you mean how did we know they were authentic?
Okay.
Well, that's a
Did
very good
Did
question.
an agent come over and go, oh yeah, that's
No, well, that was my first important question to answer. Are these authentic? Because frankly, you know, you get a document talking about there's an FBI, we want you to make people think there's an FBI behind every mailbox. You know, is this a hoax? So the first question was to establish that they were authentic. I was dealing with sources unknown, stolen files. So are these real? And there was a reporter at the Washington Post whose responsibility was to cover the Justice Department and the FBI. And that morning, he was up there at the press room of the FBI. And right before I went out and talked to the national editors about what I had just received, he had called and said, did the Post receive the files? And he knew what the members of Congress had received. The FBI had, press room people had described that to him. And so I called him at that point, and they said he had called. And I called him and said, okay, I've received files that claim to be authentic FBI stolen files. I described them, and he went to the FBI and came back and said, yes, those are copies of the stolen files. So we knew then that they were authentic. What I had no idea of at the time was that they thought that because they confirmed that they were authentic, that we would not publish them. And so,
Even though John Mitchell called every hour.
that's right. So that we're up to about 11 o'clock in the morning from about the time I just described. And I'm back there writing, calling people in Philadelphia who are named in the files and who were former sources of mine when I was in Philadelphia, not knowing that there's another thing going on all day. And that is that John Mitchell, the Attorney General, who you will remember from another burglary that took place, that John Mitchell was calling Ben Bradley and Catherine Graham throughout the day, beginning at 11 o'clock in the morning and through the evening, demanding that they not publish and saying that they would endanger national security, reveal military secrets, none of which was true. I mean, fortunately, we could see that from the files. But it was a big threat that they were making. And then about 4:30 in the afternoon, the Attorney General put out a bulletin to all the wire services demanding that anybody who had copies of the files not make them public and return them to the FBI immediately. And the paper, the attorney for the paper told Catherine Graham, the publisher, that she should not publish, and she was inclined not to publish. So it was a very difficult struggle, and Ben Bradley was very strong on convincing her then, as he would when the Pentagon Papers came 3 months later. This is a very important story that should be published.
And congratulations on working for an unbelievable boss.
That's right.
Would you,
That's right.
Betty, while you have the mic, would you talk about this new Catherine Graham documentary? Which you
Yes, thank you for a minute. There's a Catherine Graham documentary that's come out, just came out this week, I think, and you can stream it on Amazon.
There's an irony in that.
Yeah. It's not being shown in connection with the documentary Amazon is doing on Melania, by the way. But I saw it just a couple of nights ago, and it's quite good. In fact, it's the best thing that I've seen on Catherine Graham and how her conscience evolved to be extraordinary during those years.
And her memoir as well.
Yes, and then this is based, I think, very closely to her memoirs. And to a number of interviews that she gave, televised interviews that I was unaware of, the excerpts from.
I saw a question in the back. Okay, right here, Chief.
Betty and Keith, I was curious to know, given that the media office was a small residence, FBI office, how hopeful were you that you were going to find something in those files? What kind of expectations did you have going
For
in?
Bonnie.
Well, to be honest, we really did not know, and that was one of the really problematic parts of our of the action. But we concluded that this is a huge bureaucracy we're talking about, and probably they keep records about everything under the sun in one form or another. And then the FBI was so active in this area because of the protests against the war, the Quakers, the Catholic left, and all of the colleges and universities in the area. So they were busy watching all of these different groups, and probably were keeping records of everything they were doing to keep tabs on all of those. So we figured there would be at least a way to follow a paper trail to see, to get the documentation that we needed. And then we were just amazed when we started sorting through the documents that we sorted them, and only 40% of them approximately had anything to do with actual crime, like bank robbers and stolen cars, kidnappings. 60% of the files had to do with political surveillance, and much of it secret surveillance. Very much like the Stasi in East Germany. I mean, it was shocking to see what this small office was so busy doing under the directions of J. Edgar Hoover. I mean, he kept tabs on even these smaller offices, but particularly in Philadelphia, because there was so much what he considered subversive activity going on in the Philadelphia area. Not just the anti-war movement, but the Black empowerment movement as well.
Keith, you want to add?
Just one thing on to that point. Media wasn't our first choice. That was the second choice. We were hoping to do Philadelphia FBI office, but their security was just too good, and the building was too busy 24/7. So we had to go with number 2.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Davey. First of all, your new biggest fan. Love all you guys. So one question I had that really stood out to me in the documentary was the role of Xerox in all of this. So, I mean, it was interesting because it's like we run into the same issue today of a lot of tech companies that have data, that have all this accumulated stuff. If the government comes to them and asks like, hey, can we have an unlock code so we can get so-and-so's phone open or whatnot? Do you see Xerox's actions as kind of a missed opportunity to perform what could have been justice in that case?
Well, I assume you're thinking of the awful day in John Rain's office.
We have a theory about it. We have a theory.
They went back and forth with various officials at Xerox at the Philadelphia office, and then in, I guess, Rochester, where their national headquarters were. In the end, and by the way, with the head of the company coming back from vacation and being aghast that anybody in the company had ever thought of not cooperating fully with J. Edgar Hoover, who had told everybody in the FBI to stop using Xerox copiers, and the whole FBI used them, so that was going to be a great problem if they changed, and in the end they didn't. But I think, given the papers that John had copied on that drum in his office, that the man in the little white car with the Xerox label on it, the drum that man took back to Philadelphia headquarters, I think that it's highly possible there was an act of resistance within, either on his part or somebody else inside the Philadelphia office of Xerox. Because the markings on that drum, I mean, one of the things that became clear was that you could trace any copy back to the drum it was made on, and hundreds, if not thousands, of copies were made on the drum in John's office, and they did not trace them back.
We also think that perhaps Xerox finally just didn't like being bullied by the FBI. I mean, it's reasonable to think that that might have been a response, and then just didn't cooperate in the way that they were expected to cooperate.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Oh, yeah.
This is a question for Betty. So, if my memory is correct, the FBI tried to get the records of the locksmith ledger that ran the correspondence course for locksmiths. How did that go? Did they turn over the records? I don't remember.
Well, there was one that you were familiar with.
Well, that's what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
I mean,
That's how I
there were
remember.
a few companies, but there was the one that you had been.
Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and they went through all of the records.
So they did give it to him.
They did give it to them. They did give it to them. And they went through all of it, and you were a named suspect, and they failed to see your name there.
Wow. It's better to be lucky than smart.
Yeah, but you were both.
I'd like to hear more about, the revelations and the consequences because of the church committee and so on. Did it change the FBI for a while and change governance in the FBI?
Thank you for asking that. I mean, one of the things that we haven't said was the really powerful revelations and then the power that the revelations had. I mean, in addition to what we've learned about the involvement with students and professors, and the FBI behind every mailbox, and that's awful enough. And the learning that the initial concern, the initial motivation was, is the FBI illegally suppressing dissent, was quickly found in these documents. But the documents led to much more than discovery than that, which happened over a period of time. And thanks largely to another journalist, Carl Stern from NBC, who covered the FBI and saw this crucial file. It was a mere cover sheet, but it had COINTELPRO in big letters at the top of it. And Carl was very astute and decided, I'm going to find out what that is. And that opened another gate more than like 2 years after the burglary. And he filed the FBI refused to explain to him what COINTELPRO was. And this was the program that behind the public revelations, the FBI would, especially Hoover, was just crazy to prevent from being revealed. But then after Hoover died and Carl discovered the term, and he filed the first lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act to compel the FBI to provide documents, not that would reveal the operations, but what the definition of the operation was. And he won his lawsuit, and it revealed the programs were established beginning in 1956, and the point of them was to not only to suppress dissent, but to harass people and to cause harm to people and organizations. And all of it was illegal. But what ended up being discovered was that it was very severe. It was dirty tricks operations that were conducted throughout the country, all of this in deep secrecy. Dirty tricks, including breaking up marriages, setting organization against organization in order to cause violence, which was done between black organizations in cities all over this country, but and also including even murder.
The murder of Fred Hampton.
The murder of Fred Hampton, but more than that, something that didn't have the COINTELPRO label, but was the same kind of technique against low-level mob people in Boston, where Hoover approved in advance that an FBI informer would murder someone, and then also approved the informer figuring 4 other low members of the mob as the people who did the murder when they were totally innocent. And then the FBI trained him to perjure himself at trial, and they were convicted, and they were in prison for decades trying to prove their innocence and not able to do so until after 2 of them had died in somewhere around 2010.
All right, we have time for one more question. One hand. Right here.
I'm curious about the 9th member of the committee. I believe the identity is still secret, but I wondered if that person is alive, and it occurs to me that Betty might not even know the name of that person.
Keith?
No, I know. We all know. We all know.
And there is another chapter to his story that I can recount if you want me to.
Okay.
Give her the microphone.
He did come to our house, and with this claim that we had documents that were threatening national security, had to do with silos, missile silos around Philadelphia. Nothing whatsoever that was legitimate. And so we invited him in, and he stayed a couple of days with us. He helped us paint our kitchen, and it didn't need painting, but we sort of bonded with him while we were painting the kitchen. And at some point, my husband said, how did you learn about these national security files? And he said, well, my girlfriend told me. And John said, how long has she been your girlfriend? And he said, oh, maybe 3 months or so. And John said, have you ever considered that she is a double agent and has tried to manipulate you in this way to get to us? He didn't follow through on any of that, fortunately. That's how that played out.
Yep.
So I hope this is not too far off topic, but to follow up on your question about whether the culture of the FBI and the practices changed, which I think they did. But sort of an interesting personal anecdote that happened many years later. I have a younger relative who's now retired, but he was very highly placed in federal law enforcement, which is about all I can say. And he told me a story a couple of years after the book came out. He was leading a team that was about to raid somebody, and one of the younger members of his team was complaining vociferously about, why do we have to fill out all these layers of paperwork and get the judge to approve it and then approve it again and approve it again? We know these guys are dirty. Why do we need to go through all these conniptions? And my relative said, well, if you don't know why, read this book and you'll find out. And I was very encouraged by that, because this guy's not a flaming leftist, let me tell you. But he really believes in the rule of law, not the rule of humans. So I think, sometimes there is some hope in that kind of thing.
So I think, certainly in the time in which we live, I think the inspiration of what these people did, of how they were willing to risk a lot for their own values, for the values of our country. I think we also see the importance of the role of a free press. Please subscribe to your local newspaper, whether that's in digital form or whatever form. I mean, it's never been more important. And I think we all just have to carry this courage into our daily lives. So please join me in thanking